Stephanie Larson is traveling and unavailable to present, but we have John Gorman, who's the vineyard manager at Stuhlmuller Vineyards, to present vines and ovines and using grazing to manage vegetation and control of weeds. Welcome, John.
Thanks a lot, Cindy.
You're welcome. Can we get you can share your presentation?
Great. So the presentation today is integrating sheep into vineyards and how to manage that successfully. So I'll begin there. There's a bunch of different stuff to cover today, so we'll just get started. As everyone knows, grazing is done both domestically and in the wild by all sorts of ruminants, but the sheep have been used along with fire as the oldest vegetative management tool known to man. So it has some historical basis. As you graze a field or in a vineyard, it changes the plant communities. It's interesting, the Bagrata talked before me, the mustards crops are one of the favorite grazing crops for the sheep. So that could also be used as a management tool, as we'll get into a little further here. So as you said, the weed control options in a vineyard are varied. Obviously, the herbicide chemical usage is a primary one, mechanized, discs, harrows and whatnot. In a vineyard setting, obviously, we're not using fire, but overall, in a ecological sense, it can be used. And manually, obviously, sometimes with younger plantings, we don't want to use herbicides as much. So that can also be it. But sheep are used as a biological means. And there's various considerations with using sheep in a vineyard. As you see in the middle section there, the cost, availability of them, access to the vineyard for the sheep, how practical is it? We're going to discuss that further on. Obviously, they have different controls, whether you have if you're on herbicide drift, we talked about earlier, maybe that's less socially acceptable than running sheep in the vineyard. But how does that affect your neighbors? These are things to be played off each other, and how each vineyard has a different relationship with their neighbors and school settings and whatnot around them. So a sheep can be utilized in many different ways, but it's very site specific. So while you're using grazing, there are certain objectives that you want to obtain. Some may be different from different vineyard operators and others. Obviously, the reduction of use of chemicals, if you're trying to be more organic or are certified organic, is a great option. That you can always use them in a conventional setting with similar benefits. The reduction of mechanical vegetation control, that is really dependent on weather, of course. You can't get into the fields too early, and you're going to cause more of a mess than you intend to. Whereas if you were grazing sheep in a vineyard, there is really no time where the sheep cannot be in the vineyard as long as it's before bud break. We can talk about different various trellis type sets that you can even keep sheep in longer after bud break and potentially the whole year. Obviously, people are becoming a little bit more aware of greenhouse gas emissions and trying to control those. So there is a reduction in atmospheric carbon emissions by not using mechanical vegetation control as much. Reduction of labor costs, that's something that can be, we're going to be discussing further later on, but you can have reduction in labor costs as long as you control the labor costs for the management of the grazing program. This improved soil quality is something that is not only seen through the ecosystem services that the sheep provide, but also in a mix of various NPK throughout the vineyard from manure. And we'll also have a separate slide to talk about that further. Improved yield and fruit quality of the fruit can be seen in different studies that have been done, but it really is site dependent, as we well know. Incorporate organic and sustainable vineyard management practices. Obviously, that's dependent on what your grape sales look like and how you'd want to incorporate that with your management practices. So improving healthy soils, we all want to do that, but the available nitrogen is pretty low in sheep manure, but the phosphorus and potassium levels are some of the highest out of any ruminants that graze. That's excellent, especially with the phosphorus being something that is almost impossible to create in the vineyard besides being mined and applied via fertilizer. So it is a very interesting component of grazing sheep in the vineyards. Of course, you cannot over fertilize with sheep manure, not in the scale of grazing within the vineyard. So that not only helps with supporting great young root development early, but you're also having an immediate bioavailability through that manure and not worrying about any burn throughout the season. So if we talk about sheep and why we would want to run them in the vineyards, the first thing we'd have to think of what sort of sheep we'd like. Obviously, the bigger breeds, and we're going to have another slide about breeds, can graze a little bit higher, have different browsing techniques. Some breeds are a little bit more hardy than others. Well, if you don't want to spend half your day worrying about, if we're having too many issues with the health of the sheep, a more hardy breed is, useful. The age of the sheep. Older animals are more likely to have better browsing habits, something that you would want to have in the vineyard and then be able to knock down certain, noxious weeds and annual grasses a little earlier in the season. If you bring in a bunch of young lambs, that could be a little bit more of a problematic situation, not only managing them, but also their diet is not going to be as diverse at that point. If you bring in wethers and ewes, meaning female sheep, that's much better management, easier management than bringing in rams, obviously, that have a little bit preoccupation other than grazing most of the time. The physiological condition of the animals are also determining how and when you can graze in the vineyard. If most people do not like to have a lambing program inside of a vineyard because it's hard to access those new moms. And so that's something to keep in mind as to when you would breed an animal if you do have a breeding program as part of your flock management in the vineyard. The nice thing about grazing the sheep in the vineyard is that you have another agricultural product at your disposal at the end of the year. Not only do the sheep provide meat or wool in some cases, not all sheep do that, but even some sheep provide some milk products as cheese and yogurts. There's landscape management is something that is really more what a lot of people that are grazing sheep in vineyards are also getting into, meaning reduction of fuel loads, so fire control. And obviously, agritourism, adding that to direct-to-consumer market and really making sure that you can utilize all the benefits of marketing as you graze sheep in the vineyards. So as I said, this is an important thing to keep in mind when you're grazing sheep in the vineyards is what sort of breeds that you would be more interested in. Because sheep have been bred for so long, there are many different breeds of sheep that would be useful in a vineyard that would not be useful in a dairy industry, that would not be useful in a wool industry. So that's really important to start to focus on what your goals are and what you'd like to see as another value-added crop if you were to graze sheep in the vineyards. Like I said, thousands of distinct breeds of sheep, over 50 breeds in North America alone. Most of them did originate in Europe, but there is a large population of 4 different breeds in the United States: Suffolk, Dorset, Rambouillet, Hampshire, and Columbia. Most of those breeds are very useful in a vineyard in that they are large and they can graze over numerous different species, plant species. This is explaining some of the breeds already here. They produce not only medium clip of wool, but excellent meat products. They're excellent fast growers, so you can use that forage available in the vineyard after harvest all the way until bud break in most trellis setups. There is also breeds called a hair breed, which were developed in tropical regions, Barbados, St. Croix. They are lower to the ground and they do not need any shearing throughout the year. They're also very heat resistant and tolerant, so that is something important, especially if you were to have your own flock and you need to manage them in the summer months when you typically do not graze them in a vineyard. They have excellent reproductive capabilities, so you can get up to 3 or 4 lambs per ewe per year. So you do get a little bit more reproduction capabilities for the smaller size and less meat productivity. So the stocking rates are really important depending on what sort of breeds you choose. I didn't really, in the picture here displayed, you can see these baby doll Southdown sheep. They were very popular about a decade ago to introduce to the vineyards, and with success. However, they obviously do not provide an excellent meat product at the end of the year. So tailoring your management technique to what you're looking for out of grazing, whether that be an actual meat product at the end of the year or just successful grazing and vegetation management in the vineyard and a nutrient program in the vineyard through the manure, is sometimes those are 2 different solutions there. So the number of acres is not only the amount of time that you spend in that acreage, but the available forage therein is critical. If you want to, the goal here is that you're trying to put as many sheep on as few amount of acres with as much available forage as possible. So in an ideal situation, you'd have, let's say, a cover crop at about 4 inches, and you'd move them in a stocking density of 10 sheep per half acre, and you would move them every day. But that's obviously a very highly labor-intensive process. So management techniques come into play about how much time you want to spend on managing that grazing rotation. But in that way, you're in a very close, quickly moved grazing rotation. You're getting the most, you're getting the least amount of problems from, you're getting the largest bang for your buck as far as the nutrient deposits and grazing down all the unwanted weeds and cover crop in that time period. So as you integrate sheep into the vineyard, you want to be particularly concerned with the nutrition of the sheep, potentially reproduction, if that is something you're interested in. And then, of course, any diseases that are naturally occurring within the flock itself. The biggest problem, I would say, in grazing sheep in the vineyard is a predator management. As we all know, coyotes chewing on drip lines is an old pastime, and that does not mean having sheep in your vineyard will help that. So a lot of the times, if you know that you're in a high coyote dense area, a guard animal is necessary. That means that you have a protection for the sheep, but you also will have a reason to go out and check the sheep at least once a day to care for the livestock guardian dog. Herein are a few right there. A Great Pyrenees, Akbash, and Anatolian Shepherds are all excellent livestock guardian dogs. They have, it really depends on whether you want to use one. Obviously, there is a added labor practice having one available there, but you do make sure that your flock is protected from any coyotes at that point. It's important to train the young livestock guardian dogs independently with the sheep. They basically bond with the sheep and have want to stay with them. If they're not introduced early enough, then they'll want to come back and be associated with humans. So what are the typical concerns that are brought up when we're grazing sheep in a vineyard? Well, it's, as I alluded to earlier, it may not always be as simple and potentially cheaper, but not always, than mechanical and chemical control of vegetation. Now, the important thing is that people want to have a similar goal in mind. Like I said, is it trying to produce a secondary product that the sheep can provide, or is it producing a nutrient management plan and a bio weed control program in the vineyard? Which one is more important? That's going to lead you towards a way that you can use sheep in a constructive way rather than trying to do too much with too little. Not everyone is going to want to go out and purchase a flock and manage it themselves. So there are, grazing vineyards is a business, and there are various shepherds that go out and do that as a biocontrol. So vineyard managers must understand how they have to either be able to compensate those people for that service or take it on themselves. That's a really critical component, to have great communication between that grazer and the vineyard manager. So the important part of this as well is that I didn't allude to earlier, is not only is the predator risk probably the #1 issue of grazing sheep in the vineyard that needs to be discussed, but it doesn't always have to be done through a livestock guardian dog. The shelter and well handling of sheep can really take away a lot of that need for a dog that couldn't provide complications, especially if you're close to an urban area. Of course, that adds human labor to the process, but a shelter can prevent any sort of coyote kills that can be the primary concern with grazing sheep in the vineyard in the dormant months. So how do we actually go in and separate out certain acres in a vineyard for grazing under a dense mob of sheep? Well, as you see in the picture here, it's usually through a woven wire fence. You usually have a permanent fence, a vineyard, either a deer fence around or even a smaller fence than that can be on the perimeter of a vineyard. And then in between the rows, a high tensile electric fence is set up as a temporary fencing to ensure that the sheep are grazing exactly where you want them, and then can be moved depending on the management practice, so that you have a more dense mob, and also you're able to deter predators from coming inside the vineyard, inside where the sheep are grazing. That is something that is actually pretty straightforward and quite easy to set up, but it is something that your team would have to become familiar with, and a little bit of training goes a long way with being able to do that within the vineyard setting. So like I said, if you don't want the extra labor added to grazing the sheep yourselves in a vineyard, or having someone that you know bring their sheep in the vineyard, there are contract grazers that can come in and for a charge, graze whatever you'd like in the vineyard. Of course, most of them come with insurance policies that do cover themselves and the vineyard owner. But oftentimes the contract can be worked out with how many acres and for how long within the grazer and the vineyard manager themselves. Like I said, the grazing season really is in the dormant season in the vineyard. Depending on how much rain we get, that's usually our determining factor of when's a good time to bring the sheep in. But let's say this year's early rain in October obviously allowed us to bring in and graze earlier than what would normally happen with that amount of rain that earlier in the season. So as it says here, the graze until vines start to bud. So, typically in March, but an excellent management practice, and with an early graze, you can usually get two grazing seasons, where two grazing periods within the same season, depending on the amount of rainfall and on the site. The vineyard design is a critical component of how to graze within the vineyard. Some vineyards are even being built with higher drip wire setup, so the sheep can easily run underneath the vine. Of course, the cordon and the cane wires are set higher as well, but that is an interesting design component if you are thinking about grazing sheep in the future. If you were to replant a vineyard or plant a new vineyard, something to think about. Like I said, the rainfall and the temperature are very dependent on when the grazing season would be. So as I say earlier, the home base is always an important part of grazing the sheep. You can put a shelter in place, and that really reduces your need for a livestock guardian dog or electric fences sometimes to be required. But it does help with helping other neighbors' vineyards if they're interested in such a product and practices. Wide vine rows are usually better, more easy to graze the sheep in and move the fencing in. But also on VSP vineyards, it's quite easy because it does not sprawl out. It's easier to set up fencing in that regard, as you see here. Talked about the cordon earlier. So the drip irrigation wire is usually the only thing that can be fouled up in a grazing situation. So having the drip be a little higher to allow the sheep to pass under usually saves you some time with cleaning up popped out emitters. The electronet fencing is what I talked about briefly for grazing in between the rows. That's very easy setup and can be powered with portable solar panels and batteries. The list here, including livestock trail, water troughs, predator protection, these are all things that can be used, but are not always essential towards starting a grazing operation on a vineyard. Just want to wrap it up, but I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Okay, thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, John. There are several questions in the chat. I think one you may have already answered. The person asked if you have any tips on preventing the sheep from damaging drip lines and vine trellises by running into or pulling on or dragging them.
Yeah, so raising the drip wire is the easiest method. That would be my primary, what I would do first. Secondarily, if you were to have clips that they're rubbing on and whatnot, you can always put on outside of the vineyard. You can put a couple T-posts on and they usually like to rub on those more outside of the vineyard. So it's sort of depending on if it's a rubbing issue they're doing or if they're running underneath and getting caught. So those are two different ways that I've usually tried to solve that problem in the past.
And then do you have any information on grazing with geese?
Geese? No, but I don't. I look for that.
Yeah, there's another question that says, do you know of any shepherds that will service small vineyards in Mendocino County? Is there some type of directory or any consultants that can help get us started?
Yeah, sure. My email is below, and I think Michelle can probably get me your contact as well, and I can send out a list of people in Sonoma and Mendocino that do service vineyards for grazing.
Yeah, and then another question is, what are the soil compaction concerns?
Well, the soil compaction concerns are quite minimal, I think, compared to any heavy disking. Obviously, there is some concern around where they bed down, if there's usually is one specific area, but that is usually not inside of a vineyard row. Usually it's on an end row. They all want to be together, so there's usually not enough space inside the vineyard row itself. So I would say minimal compaction concerns compared to heavy equipment usage.
The next question is, are there any herbicides that would prevent running sheep in a vineyard?
Well, you usually want to graze and then spray. Or if you spray, you'd want to wait about a week and a half to 2 weeks before you're going to bring the sheep back in. It's not any glyphosate is not going to be detrimental to the sheep as long as you get the you follow the label as far as the withdrawal period.
And then another question is, what is the cost per acre to graze, and what is the cost to move and set up to a new location?
Yeah, well, that I'm not going to comment on because it really varies grazer to grazer. If you're going to have a contract grazer come in, it really is dependent on how many clients he or she has and how close they are to where your vineyard is. Sometimes you can get a real bargain depending on if they're available and if they're close. But if they're traveling from a far distance, they will have a higher setup fee. But usually it's based on a per head, per day price.
Yeah, and the final question, are you aware of any grants for growers, landowners interested in employing grazing herds?
I'm not, but that's a great idea. We should work on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.